Welcome to the #1 show and the source of truth for all things MedTech. Here, we reveal the secrets and stories behind the investments, science, and commercialization of the MedTech industry. Every week, we'll take you on a wild ride with the biggest names in the game, from entrepreneurs and investors who are shaking up the market to healthcare providers who are revolutionizing the way we think and practice medicine. So hold on tight and get ready for a journey like no other. This is the State of MedTech. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the show. And this episode was actually in partnership with Clari. We did this as a live stream webinar. If you want to view it so you can see the slides and just, of course, watch me and Coleman and our amazing facial expressions, you can watch it on YouTube and Spotify. So let me ask you a question. And actually, this question is something that we all ask ourselves within our organizations. Are we going to meet, beat, or miss revenue? Now, the answer to the most important question in business actually is found in our revenue cadence. And what is revenue cadence? What revenue cadence is the ongoing motion of revenue moments that teams leverage across quarters to deliver predictable, repeatable revenue precision. And as students of revenue, who better to do this, episode with than with Clari? Clari is constantly learning from the best organizations around the world who focus on revenue, and specifically on revenue collaboration and governance. And we talk a little bit about this in this episode and live stream, specifically around these key areas. The state of selling in MedTech, and this is the part where I very graciously volunteered myself to talk about all the problems that we have in our industry. How do we treat sales and revenue like a process, right? If you've heard me say this many times, that sales is not just an event or an outcome. It's a process, right? And treating sales and revenue like a process is probably the most important part. And then we get into Q&A. Now, before we get into this, a couple things. One, you've probably heard me talk about Clari. Clari is an amazing software company that essentially helps you protect and get the most out of your CRM investment. CRMs are great, but let's face it, it ends up being an administrative task for sales reps. And for sales leaders, you end up with a bunch of data and lack of data at the end of a quarter, and then you try and make decisions off of that. Data seamlessly integrates with your CRM to give you predictable insights, automate things, and essentially solve a lot of problems that many of us deal with, such as essentially trying to manage highly sophisticated, complex pipeline processes with lack of data or no data at all, right? And so what I highly recommend is check the show notes below, click the link, and get that demo with Clari. I think you're going to get a lot of insights from their team, whether you're a small startup or more established organizations. They've worked with some really amazing companies in our space, and their analysis and demo on how do you think about revenue collaboration, and the cadence is great. Which leads me to my last piece. Clari has been extremely kind to give the revenue cadence playbook for free. And when I say for free, you can check the show notes below. There's a PDF to click, and it'll take you straight to the PDF. You're not going to go to a lead gen form. You're not going to have to put an email in. You literally go straight to this PDF. And I want you to go there. And some of you sales and marketing leaders, maybe you might be a little bit caught off guard because you're going to be seeing a lot of things in this revenue playbook that you're not used to seeing. But I'm telling you right now, this is the future of our industry. I've been talking about this with investors, with VCs. This is where we're going. We have to get more sophisticated, especially as more savvy tech and SaaS investors come into our industry. They have a different set of criteria. Plus, the VCs and investors who are already in our industry, they're wanting more sophisticated, more predictable approaches when it comes to revenue. We have to start learning this from now. Go through that revenue cadence playbook. You're going to absolutely love it. So with that being said, let's get on to our episode with SVP of marketing over at Clari, Coleman, and myself, as we talk about revenue cadence and how it can boost your sales performance. Enjoy.
The pressure is on. What challenges are sellers facing today in MedTech? And this one was #1 on your list when we were talking about this last week. You said selling is an art, not a science. Tell us more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to understand the history of medical sales. And so if you go back even 10 years, but let's just, go to the boom days of our industry, which really was the 80s and 90s. A lot of medical sales was based on the idea that as a seller, you were approached by a company, whether as a distributor or to work W-2, because you had a relationship with a physician. And back in those days, even me, I'm not that old, but I remember the days where I was able to walk into the hospital. There's no vendor credentialing. You don't have to check in. You literally just go back to the OR. You talk to the circulating desk, say, "Hey, I'm here. I'm going to hang out with Dr. Smith, Dr. Coleman," right? Grab some of the hospital scrubs and you just walk back there and you say, "Hey, doc, I got something new in my bag." And that's for many of you who don't know, that's where we come up with the term, carrying the bag. You go to the doctor's lounge, you open up your bag, right, or tray, and you go through all the technology that you have, right? And a lot of it was based on this relationship, right? Because you developed a reputation with the doctor and they say, "Yeah, you know what? I trust Sally. I trust John. Let me try this new product." They would try it. The hospital would get billed. And that was it. It's a great time, right? Fortunately, those days are gone, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason why is because a lot of private equity is now into our industry. There's a lot of consolidation with hospitals. So you have, if you guys didn't look at the Fortune 500 list, HCA, which is a hospital system, I think is in the top 50, right? Actually, even the top 20. So when these companies come along, they don't just let the doctors use whatever they want. So now there are more decision makers. There's a process involved, and there's a lot more complexity. So it's not enough just to have a really good relationship with the physician, even though that's important. Now you have to be able not only to sell to the surgical suite, you got to be able to sell to the C-suite, meaning that you need to know how to speak to a CFO or a purchasing director or something or anything like that. So there's still some art involved in our industry. There's, the art of selling is always going to be there, but the science has to be there, because once you have these complexities, that's where you need more science, more processes, and a more sophisticated approach to do these things and drive product adoption.
That's the exact, it was super interesting because there's so many parallels with what we see in software sales, where even as recently as 5 years ago, but certainly 20 years ago, it was very relationship based. The golf course or the ball game or whatever it is, take people out, close a deal while you're on the golf course. And that just is, it's not repeatable anymore. And the trend that we're seeing is not only is that not how buyers want to buy anymore, it's not how the best sellers are selling. And part of the reason is because we have so much more data now that we never had. Selling and so much of selling was offline in previous generations. And now so much more of it is online. You have all the buying behaviors that people do before they end up in front of a salesperson, the things they are researching online, the interactivity they do on your site, whatever it may be. And then you have all these new systems to capture information, whether that's your CRM or it's, some sales engagement platform or something like that. And so the subjectivity that used to rule the day, as you were talking about, Omar, is still important. There is still absolutely artistry to the craft of selling. However, there is more objectivity, there's more repeatability, there's more data that you can apply to understand what does good look like, what are positive or negative trends, and what do I need to do as an individual seller, as a manager, as a head of sales in order to get the right productivity and get the right results from my team. So that leads us now into number 2. You mentioned deal credibility. You as a medtech seller, you may have a funnel full of deals, but how can you tell which ones are actually real?
Yeah, and I think this is the area that for those of you who listen to the show, some great capital sales leaders like Ken Husted, Joseph Othman, I'm having more come on. The one thing we always kind of circle back to is like, do you in fact have a deal, right? And I think too much, and I have to give credit where credit is due. This is where I first clicked with Clari as I was speaking to their team, and they talked about reporting the news, right? How many of us go to a deal rip or a quarterly review and, a salesperson or a rep goes up and kind of just reports the news. Oh, this is what's going on with the deal. And it's very subjectively driven. And there's no way to pressure test and actually put a microscope on the deal and say, like, is there in fact a deal here? And the only way that you can decide that is not based on what the rep is saying or what their manager is saying. It's based on objective data, right? Based on activities, based on key checklists. This is one of the things that Clari has in their revenue cadence playbook, which is a pipeline checklist, right? Do you in fact have a deal? And we have to pressure test these things. And the reason why we don't have infinite number of hours in the day, we don't have infinite reps. And so we have to decide, where are we going to focus our sales activities on deals that are going to close this quarter or this half of the year? and what other deals are we just going to nurture along? Because you have to make a decision. You have to force a choice.
Super interesting. And again, very similar and a lot of overlap with what we see sales teams going through in software sales. And you mentioned there's a lot of reporting the news when reps or managers are in their one-on-ones. And a lot of times the information they're talking about is just kind of this, they're just going through the motions and just checking a box around whatever sales methodology they happen to be following. And that's not really enough to verify that the deal is substantive or that the right things are happening. As you said, Omar, a lot of it is about the activities that are happening, the engagement of the buyer or buying group, because it's not just about one person anymore. It's often about 5, 10, sometimes 20 people that are involved in a decision-making process. And you need to understand how engaged are all those folks. And so with this combination of, you think about what we talked about in point number 1, and this combination now of thinking about deal credibility through a somewhat different lens, you are hopefully reducing the happy ears that a lot of sellers have, where they hear one thing and they maybe take it out of context and make it seem like things are going to go really well or trending really well in that deal. And you're able to kind of cut through that subjectivity and add a new lens of objectivity that's rooted in data. And I think that's a really important way to think about deal inspection and to think about what is the likelihood that this opportunity actually turns into closed business for us. And you have to apply all the lessons that you've learned in the past, as well as the trends that you're seeing in real time, in order to have a reliable forecast about what's actually going to happen in the future. So number 3 here, similar to deal credibility, and we're teasing this, and I think 1 + 2 here is going to equal 3, which is deal management. How can you think about standardizing the actual motion of managing deals, of running deals once they enter your pipe, especially as companies start to grow and you have a lot of different people that want to do things maybe slightly their own way? Well, what are you seeing in the industry, and what advice do you have, Omar?
Yeah, I think this is the area, and especially when it comes to the scaling side, where companies they really struggle a lot, and that's because like not every deal is created equal, right? But there are signs in terms of what qualifies as a good deal and what's a deal that's manageable, right? And again, like this is where optimizing your CRM and understanding, like, is the data actually reflecting a deal that has the right acceleration within pipeline to move forward to those next inflection points, right? And I think that's the biggest thing is, and in terms of the deal management side, a lot of times, you're not going to get engagement from your deal every single week, although you should, in my opinion. But in that side, when those deals aren't being engaged, what could you be doing outside of those deals? Like, for example, prospecting is something you have to do every single week, whether you like it or not. And a lot of times when it comes to deal management, if there are certain deals that are really big, a lot of sales leaders will abandon the activity of prospecting just to manage those deals. But that's something that you end up shooting yourself in the foot, because once those deals either close or let's say they get lost, you have to start all over again with the prospecting to generate that momentum and that sales motion.
This is something that we see all the time, that momentum getting lost. And often what happens, especially inexperienced managers, what they will do when they're trying to coach their teams on how to standardize deal execution is they will trust their sellers to do the right things without verifying that the right things are happening. And in many cases, from a managerial standpoint, that trust is an admirable quality. Of course, you want to provide people with autonomy. You want to make sure that they can go and individualize and run deals the way that skates toward their strengths. But at the same time, you need to standardize in order to scale. And there are some things that are non-negotiable with respect to deal management and deal execution. So as a sales leader, as a manager on a team, you need to provide the structure. You need to know what good looks like, but you need to leave room within that structure for individual autonomy. And if you can trust but verify and have the make sure that the right things are happening at the right times, this is how you're going to create a real repeatable motion. We see a lot of times, especially when you're more focused in selling upmarket, selling to enterprise companies, that it's kind of a feast or famine thing. And a company may go and win this really big deal, but have no idea how they did it. Like, is it actually a repeatable process? Maybe not. And so you need to think not just about the outcome of closing the deal, but you need to think about the process that is required in order for you to get there. It's not saying that every deal is going to be the exact same, of course not, but there are going to be hallmarks in all these different deals that you can coach and train your sales reps to make sure they're keeping an eye out for, or even introducing into the sales cycle in order to lend itself to repeatability and in order to have that kind of execution that can yield success that compounds. All right, last on the list here, number 4. We talked a little bit about it. One of the main trends here is that you have more data sources. One of the problems that we see that you were talking about, Omar, is that a lot of companies have a CRM. They're using Salesforce or they're using some sort of customer relationship manager. They're not getting the full value out of it. And provocatively, we're saying that the CRM can be an anchor instead of an accelerator. So talk to us a little bit about the kind of the misuse of CRM.
Yeah, what a great what a great question, Kyle. So, in our industry, Salesforce has been adopted I'd say in the last like 5 or 6 years. And it's because it's like, oh, if you're a legit company, that's what you do. You invest in Salesforce. There's not a single rep out there who hits quota or President's Club who says, "Man, thank God for Salesforce." And and I know it's the same in SaaS as well. And the one pushback that I always hear is just like, "Hey, while I'm wasting time updating the CRM, I could be selling." And a lot of times the issue in our industry, and again, with all due respect, a lot of people are listening. A lot of the marketers are going to be listening to this on the recording. Salesforce is implemented not as a tool to help the sales team, but as a tool for marketing to extract data from the sales team and monitor them. And that's why I think a lot of sellers don't see it as like a valuable activity. Plus, to be frank, the fish stinks always from the head. And so a lot of times a VP of sales doesn't really adopt these things as well. And so when you make it difficult for a sales team to manage this CRM, but even more so, if you don't teach them how do you actually use this tool to make your deals better, you're not going to have adoption. And as a result, you have missing data, you have bad data. And then at the end of the quarter, end of the year, your VP of sales and VP of marketing are at each other's necks because there's all this bad data and everybody's trying to make a decision off of it. And so I think like this is, again, I don't mean to plug, but this is why I when I first heard about Clari and I learned about it, this is why I really enjoyed what you guys do, because essentially it's making this process easier and allowing you to extract all these insights in a way that's actually going to objectively drive a deal forward. That's the whole point of all this. In 2023, the teams that have the best data and the clearest data are the teams that are going to be winning, because then you're going to focus on where you should put your energy, time, and resources and where you shouldn't. If you don't, now you're just treating every single deal like there's a deal. And that's where you have all these issues. And I know for a fact, I see a few names that I recognize. For those of you who are covering not just a state, but a region, right? Like the Pacific Northwest or all of the South, those are a lot of deals. Those are a lot of accounts. You can't spread yourself across all those, and not all of them are supposed to be treated equally.
It's so interesting, Omar, because again, you hit the nail on the head. We have the abundance of data is something of a double-edged sword, and I'm just as guilty as any other marketer out there. I want to know what's going on. I want to see the detail. I want to see the data, and more often than not, a lot of that data is created from the engagements that sellers are having directly with prospects. And the old school way of thinking is that the only way to get that information out of the rep's head and into the CRM is a manual data entry process. But as you rightly said, no seller has ever in the history of sales been excited to enter data manually into a CRM. And so what the best revenue teams are doing is they're not saying, oh, it's too hard to get this data. I know I need it, but I just can't get it. So forget about it. We're going to go back to 1990 and we're just going to continue to sell with our gut instead of with our head. What they are doing is they're finding ways to automate the capture of the data that they need. So they're really critical about what is that essential data that we really need, and how can we reduce the level of manual effort to capture that data from calendars, from emails, from meetings, from engagements, the activities that buyers are doing, as I mentioned before, on your website or elsewhere. And how can we get that into CRM in a way that is useful to us from a marketing and leadership standpoint, but also useful to the rep? And that's the key. If we're capturing data and exposing it in a way that's useful to the individual rep, we're going to be creating a virtuous cycle where they know that this data is useful to them, and they're going to be more inclined to play ball in the instances where you need them to actually do the manual data entry, because it's not all completely automatable. There are
Right.
always going to be things that require the insight or the perspective of the actual person, boots on the ground, who's having that interaction. Any response to that, Omar?
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. And again, not all data is going to be automated, but this is the one thing I think sellers need to be educated the right way, which is how do you actually look at data so that you're getting the insights you need. And especially if you're manually entering things, there's things that you intuitively are going to see in the data that nobody else is going to see. The one thing, because I'm a startup guy, and I think a lot of companies who are at a Series A, Series B point, they'll adopt Salesforce, and they may not think they're at this point to think about this. If you look at everything through the lens of either psychology or physics, the world makes sense. And so as your organization grows in mass, you need a larger force to actually change direction, right? And so a lot of times I tell VPs and chief commercial officers who have maybe a sales team of 3 or 4 people, this is the perfect time to start figuring this stuff out, because your team is small enough that it's going to be a lot easier of a lift to implement these things. And you're not gonna figure it out and have your cadence in a quarter. It's going to take a full year of you tweaking and adjusting things to figure out, like, when's the best time for us to do, let's say, a weekly meeting, a quarterly review? How do we do these things? And so it's so much easier to do that earlier on and grow into it than, let's say, when you have a sales team of 20, 30, 40, 50 people. You can't do it, obviously, at that point. You have to, right? But for those who are at small organizations, this is, in my opinion, like the best time to do it. And I'll use myself as an example. I have a small company that I started last year. I have sellers now working for me. I adopted some of these approaches when it was just me, because then it becomes a lot easier to change and adjust these things and think about, like, okay, if we're going to manually enter data, what's the data that's actually worth manually entering in? Like, it's an ongoing process.
That's exactly right. And it's easy to get seduced by the need for more data. And it's easy for you to go and ask your sellers to, it's death by a thousand cuts. Oh, we just need this one field. And then a week later, it's, oh, well, it'd be nice to have this other field. And then by the end of a quarter, all of a sudden you've introduced 20 new fields that you're asking your reps to enter every time a deal reaches a certain stage or whatever it may be. And that stuff really adds up, and it is very irritating to reps. I saw a stat, I can't remember the exact percentage, but I have the ballpark, which is something like 35% of sellers' time is spent not selling.
Yeah, that's terrible. That's terrible. Kyle, I'm just curious, your advice to the marketing leaders who are hearing this, in terms of what's your heuristic in terms of determining whether a certain data point is worth asking the sellers to enter or not. Do you have any advice on that? Because this is a problem in our industry. It's like, anytime there's like, oh, we think this might be valuable, let's just go ahead and get it. But again, death by 1,000 paper cuts. What's your advice?
It's a really good question, Omar, and it's going to be different for every company. I would maybe reframe the question a little bit differently to say, what data capture can we automate? Let's start there. Because if we're trying to do, all the bells and whistles, and we're like, well, it'd be really nice to know what the middle initial is of the CFO at this deal once we reach stage 3. It's like, well, okay, but maybe that's a nice to have. Let's focus on the core stuff. Are we actually getting all of the buyers that are involved in a deal in our CRM? Sounds pretty basic, right? But you'd be shocked. Right? I think it's something like 60% of the contacts that your sales team is engaging with never make their way into the CRM. And so from a marketing standpoint, what am I supposed to do with that? If I don't actually know who is involved when in a deal cycle, I can't be an effective marketer. I may be completely unaware of a certain buying persona that exists in deals that we're completely ignoring because we have no visibility into that. And it's especially true, over the last 3 years, things have been changing so rapidly. And now with the macro environment being what it is, there are just different sets of stakeholders in deals at different times. And so you could, number one, this is the posture that a lot of companies take, require your sellers to manually create contacts in their CRM. I have done this. I don't know how many people on this call have manually created a contact record in Salesforce. It is a pain in the butt. Like, it takes time. I know it doesn't seem like a huge thing, but 5 or 10 minutes to create a single contact record, if you're engaging with 20 or 30 people, across that deal, that really adds up. So I'm a marketer. I know I need to know who we're selling to and when. I know I can't have my sellers do this because it's not an effective use of their time. And so how can I automate that? And if you can figure out how to automate it, and Omar's, I don't want to make this a Clari commercial, but Clari solves this. If you can solve that in an automated way, you're going to be helping yourself and you're going to be helping the reps, because then all of the information they need about who they're engaging with is all going to be captured in the CRM. And then when they're doing deal inspections, when they're doing deal management, they're going to have a much more robust set of data and set of context to go and speak with their manager, their leaders about how are we going to sell to these people? What do we need to do to get it across the line? So that would be my number one piece of advice to folks, is make sure that everybody your sellers are selling to actually get into the CRM. Basic, but extremely important.
Yeah, and again, one last thing, and again, you're very sensitive about making this a Clari commercial. I'm okay with that, because again, I when I saw what you guys do, I was like, man, I wish this company existed when I was the head of marketing. Here's the biggest thing, for every leader. When you make an investment in Salesforce, like, it is not just an investment in money, it's an investment in time. So at the end of the year, you're against two committees who are going to judge you. You're the sales team, right? And then the board. The board's going to judge it based on, okay, we made this investment into Salesforce. What did we get out of it? And the sales team is going to say, the same thing, but on the time side. The way that I see Clari like really solving, and more importantly, protecting this investment, is that helping the automation and making it a lot more clear and streamlined in terms of how data gets into the system. And the other side of it, which every VP of sales is going to know what I'm talking about here. At the end of the quarter, how many of you spend literally an extra week with the head of marketing scrambling around trying to figure out how we get this data out, and like, what do we do? And it's you spend nights doing this. So it's not only the automation and the streamlining of it getting in, but more importantly, not just at the end of the quarter, but every day, every week, how that data is coming out and being presented to you so that you can actually make good decisions, right? Again, I'm going to say this because most people aren't going to admit this. The way I see this approach and the application of this technology is that not only is it enhancing and bringing out the best in your teams, this is protecting your investment and technically your jobs, because keep in mind, at the end of the year, your sales team, right, and the board are going to say, what did we get out of this, right? And you want to make sure that you put yourself in the best position to succeed in that, in answering that question.
It's really well said, Omar. Right. We're gonna keep moving because we could talk about this CRM issue all day.
Oh yeah,
it's a popular topic, but let's talk about the solution, and adding up all the things that we just talked about in numbers 1 through 4. How you can introduce some science, how you can get more deal credibility, how you can manage deals better, and then ultimately how you can leverage your CRM to serve as an accelerant at every different level for every revenue critical employee, from reps all the way up to execs. All of these things combine for the best tech sales teams we see in what we at Clari call the revenue cadence. The revenue cadence is treating revenue like a process, as I mentioned before, not just an outcome that happens at the end of a deal cycle or that happens at the end of the quarter, but it's a process that can be broken down just like any other process across your business. It can be broken down into its subcomponents, and each one of those subcomponents can be optimized. And if you think about the way that you're optimizing all of these different revenue moments, you're creating a repeatable cadence for yourself. Many companies will operate in a 13-week quarter. Some companies think more about 6 months or 12 months or something like that. But for the sake of this conversation, we're going to keep it to that quarterly increment. And so if you introduce this revenue cadence, you know what needs to happen every day, every week, every month of the quarter for every rep, every manager, every VP, every executive. You've created a revenue cadence. And I know that can sound somewhat intimidating. You can't just go and turn this all on tomorrow. It is a journey. You need to, be smart about what you introduce when, based on the level of maturity that your sales team and the personnel on your sales team has. But aspirationally, you need to know that revenue is your most important business process. It deserves to be broken down and inspected. It deserves to be improved. And so this is a more literal definition of the revenue cadence, the ongoing motion of the revenue moments that your teams are leveraging to deliver predictability in a repeatable motion. So you can drive revenue precision every single day, every week, and ultimately get to that outcome of a precise forecast that's matched by precise performance. That's what this revenue cadence is meant to do. And some issues that we're seeing here, a lot of kind of quantifying a lot of what myself and Omar just talked about, is we're seeing that on average, companies are losing 14.9% of committed deals. So this goes back to deal credibility and deal management. Sellers are saying, in blood, I'm stamping this deal. This deal is coming in. This is a committed deal. Almost 15% never turns into revenue. That sale never gets done. So why is that? A lot of it is because of the poor process management that we talked about before. And then ultimately, every company on average is leaking $24 billion of pipeline. And this is across our customer base. So all the way from SMB companies all the way up to some Fortune 50 companies. So this is on average. We're seeing that $24 billion of pipeline is lost due to poor process management and poor cadence management. And these are solvable issues. And that's what we are hoping to solve with some of these best practices that we're aggregating across our customer base. And this is the revenue cadence playbook, where we're breaking down the end-to-end revenue process into its component parts and then giving checklists on how do you actually run each of these revenue moments, from team performance to the way that you retain and expand your customer base to the way that you run forecasting and different sales analytics. I'm going to pause there, let this sit on the screen for a second, see if anybody in the chat has any questions, and see, Omar, if you have any comments.
Yeah, something I wanted to see if you can just kind of riff on a little bit is the importance of the on the team performance side in terms of the activities that are spent on a weekly and monthly basis. I think everybody has gotten better about what you do on a quarterly basis, but I feel like the weekly activities is an area that a lot of people either overdo it or don't do enough. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'll go to this next slide, which breaks things down a little bit more on the team performance front. And you can see that from a weekly standpoint, there are different categories. I mentioned before that it's not just your reps and managers, it's also your VPs and your C-level folks that need to be involved in these meetings. And so depending on the time of the month or the time and quarter, whatever it may be, the moments that you're executing against may be somewhat different. But as an example of the types of things that reps and managers need to do every week, you see it right here. Every single week in their one-on-ones, they need to be focused on, what is my prospecting strategy? Which accounts am I going to be targeting and why? That's a really, I know it sounds simple again, but when you talk to a lot of reps, they're going after an account because it's in their book or it's in their territory, and it's just the one that I happen to be prospecting into this week. That's not enough anymore. You should have way more intent to why you're targeting a certain account. You saw some sort of news that is they're trying to solve a problem, or they're doing something that your company can help them from a strategic initiative standpoint, or you got some sort of intent signal that they were searching for keywords that match keywords that your company solve. Like, there needs to be some sort of rationale, and managers need to hold their reps accountable for having that rationale. And then what managers can do is they can look across their set of direct reports and tease out patterns. Oh, interesting. 6 out of my 10 reps this week said that one of their accounts is doing XYZ. We need to create a sales play for that particular set of circumstances. And we need to enlist our marketing team to help us sell against this insight that we're learning about. And so you can create this really useful feedback loop as long as you're really intentional about these things and you're closing that feedback loop from not just across your little team of sellers, but into marketing, the rest of your sales team, up and down market into different segments, whatever it may be. So that rep and manager one-on-one is a critically important thing to look at. Where are we prospecting and why? And then the next line you see here is in-flight deal reviews. Which deals am I trying to bring in? What stage are they in? What signal are we getting? What is our next step to drive that deal forward? So those 2 weekly moments are critical for reps and managers. Does that answer the question, Omar?
Absolutely.
Cool. Ben in the chat asks, how does this differ from using traditional sales stages? Is it the implementation of certain activities in those stages? you want to take a stab at that, Omar?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think I recognize Ben. I think he's over at Relatable Health. So me personally, I think it's a couple of things. The first thing is like obviously I do believe it differs in terms of the implementation of it. Um, and the other thing is that more importantly, I think it's the management, right? I think when you take this approach, it's almost like a different it's a shift in mindset, right? I think that once you start changing your mindset about these activities, you by the nature of it, change your approach to it and change the way you manage it. So, for example, if you look at prospecting, okay, a lot of times prospecting is the last thing on people's mind unless they have no deals, right? But if they do have deals, right, prospecting is sort of like a checkbox thing, and the way you do it is just kind of randomly. The way you change that, right, is the way you implement prospecting. So, what day of the week and how do you go about prospecting? Right. The more you standardize these motions, this is my personal opinion about salespeople. Salespeople are great, but too many times they're given a cookbook of things to do, and then they decide to do whatever they want. Some people are great at taking a cookbook and making a great cuisine. Other people are just going to throw ingredients together and be like, oh, yeah, I baked the cake. Here's all the ingredients I threw together, but it's the wrong sequence. Right. So, again, it's about the implementation of it. Right. And the mindset that goes into it. I don't know if that was a good analogy to use or not, but at least that's how I always see it. And that's why in our industry, guys, it's too much of an art and there needs to be more of a science. That's why the cadence of way you do things, the sequencing, again, just to take another analogy, playing chess, you can move certain chess pieces, right, and win a game, but the sequence in which you do it is going to determine that. Right. And so the more we get better about managing these processes and thinking about how do we implement it and how do we get into a motion that's repeatable, those are the activities that are scalable. And more importantly, those are things that we can actually tweak versus, again, handing every salesperson a cookbook of stuff and saying, hey, go make a great cake. Not everybody's going to be great at making that cake if they just, get to decide what sequence they get to do things. How do they implement stuff? Right. Kyle, does that make sense?
It does, Omar. It's really well said. And I'll tack on a little bit to Ben's question is how are these different from sales stages? A lot of times sales stages are more backward looking. So there are entry criteria to get into a stage. Okay, cool. We're in that stage now. The purpose of these revenue moments where you have live team interaction is to think about the strategic go forward of what has to happen now to achieve the next stage or the next milestone or whatever it is inside of a deal. And sales stages are very useful because, again, they're standardized sort of milestones that we know have to happen or are indicators of deals trending in the right or wrong direction. But they're static and they're that framework that I mentioned before that's very useful to have. But we need to have that individual autonomy inside that framework to flex our strategic muscle to figure out what is the right next best step for this particular deal. And that's what these moments are meant to do. And you can look across any of these moments, and that's what we're trying to tease out. We're trying to get the collective wisdom of a rep and a manager or in a team setting or of our chief revenue officer, chief sales officer. We're trying to get the insight from them to figure out what is the right next best step for us to take in this deal in order to move it forward. And so I think the live meetings allow you to introduce more nuance and more strategy than a prototypical sales stage would allow you to do. And I think perhaps, let me put this on the screen 1 second. If you are interested in seeing more detail, check out the Revenue Cadence playbook. So scan this QR code, you'll be taken to the Revenue Cadence playbook. And in that playbook, Ben and everybody else in the audience, you will see the prescriptive checklist of what has to happen in each of those revenue moments. And you'll start to see more differentiation and distinction between kind of a standard sales methodology or a standard way to approach a sales stage. And you'll get a lot of detail about what actually needs to happen when my rep and manager are together or when my head of sales is running an end of quarter sequence of events call. And you'll be able to implement a lot of these things, hopefully, not all of these things overnight, but some of these things overnight in a way that's going to move your deals forward.
Kyle, if you mind, let me ask you a question real quick on the checklist. I love the checklist. The one thing that I feel that happens too often in our industry is when there's something new to implement, they kind of bite off more than they can choose. Between the three checklists, and again, there's one on pipeline inspection, one on forecasting, one on cadence builder. Where do you recommend people to start? Because me personally, I feel like to perfect that, it might take a month, maybe even a full quarter, focusing on that one checklist in terms of implementing it. I could be wrong, but what's your recommendation?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Omar. I would say, and what you're referencing actually is here. So there's kind of three different, as you mentioned before, there's three different main categories of guidance that we're offering in this revenue cadence playbook, and it all starts here: team performance. It's not the most glamorous set of things for you to do, but it's the foundation. Like, you can't build a skyscraper without a solid foundation. And so making sure that your teams are operating well together, they're capturing the right data, they're figuring out the right go forward plans at the individual deal level, at the aggregate deal level, all those things is extremely important. So creating and standardizing around team performance and the right things that have to happen so that all your revenue critical employees are doing the right things at the right time, that creates a really solid process foundation and data foundation for you to then go and build your beautiful sales skyscraper on top of.
Is there an area, this is again like and I'm speaking on behalf of the marketing leaders here, at least in your experience, is there an area that you feel that when focusing on team performance and implementation that people might overlook, or let's say doesn't put them in the best position for that team to fully adopt and implement these kind of activities?
It's going to be, you got to find the right balance between standardization and autonomy, between process and freedom. The best kind of processes create the right discipline for the right things while allowing the right kind of autonomy for other types of things. And that's different for every company. So don't be too heavy-handed. Like, that there's a certain set of things that have to be done a certain way. But keep in mind that there's a whole other set of things that can be done in different ways. And this is something I learned pretty early in my management career, where I expected everybody to find success the same way that I did. And, I started managing a team of 6 people, 8 people, and then ultimately, ended up growing to about 70 people, and realized pretty quickly that people all want to find success in their own way. And there's a certain thing Michael said in the chat: latitude on style, no compromise on results. Exactly. Like, if you can give them the right playbook for the things that you can't compromise on, the things have to happen in every deal, awesome. Like, we're selling Clari, we know that we need to engage with the head of sales. If we're not engaging with the head of sales early in a deal, that deal is not going to get done. And so that we can't compromise on that. How do you get in front of that head of sales? There's plenty of room for individual autonomy there. We have a handful of playbooks, but you can go and create your own. And so what has to happen is pretty standardized. How it happens, we've got playbooks for it, but we want you to go and flex your own creative and strategic muscles. So you got to find that balance. If you do that, you're going to have a really useful process that is balanced between art and science and allows for standardization and scale.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And one thing I wanted to mention, Kyle, is again, one of the issues we have in medtech, is over indexing, right? So a lot of times we implement, let's say, a new process and everything, we want to trust our sales team, and we're all very sensitive about this idea of micromanagement. And so they're given a little bit too much latitude, right? To do what they want. And then when that doesn't work, whether it's a quarter or two, then we over-index and end up micromanaging the hell out of them. And then everybody's miserable. And I feel like there's a happy medium there. Salespeople may not like what I'm about to say next, but I'm a salesperson myself. We're like pro athletes, right? And so we need guidance and we need like positive reinforcements all the time. And so I feel like having the right cadence every week, a salesperson is not going to feel like they're micromanaged, but rather they're going to feel like they're getting better. Like, objectively through the data, it's like, oh, here's some areas that I can work on. Here's some areas that I got to improve. I'm really good at, right? The other side, I want to kind of really encourage people. Many people know I talk about crossing the chasm, Jeffrey Moore's book. The idea of product adoption on the sales and marketing side, when we do that with our customers, that same process is applicable internally. And I mention this because when you adopt these kind of approaches, you have to think about it and say, okay, internally, who's my early adopter? Who's my visionary on the sales team that I know that gets this and will embrace it? And then how do I work with management to say, hey, I need you to help reinforce this behavior. This person, I think, is going to be our early adopter. So we need to really amplify what they're doing so that everybody else mimics that behavior and follows through, versus a lot of times we just sort of hand stuff over and we're like, this is what everybody's supposed to do. And because we assume, oh, everybody's an adult, it's going to get done. It's just not how things happen. And I think taking that product adoption approach internally allows a head of sales, a head of marketing to really look objectively and say, okay, what's the best formula that we need to make sure that the team starts seeing the way to do this, adopting it the right way, and we amplify and promote it publicly, internally, so that that behavior continues forward, versus sort of just like handing it over and then waiting a quarter. And at the end of the quarter, everybody gets that one talk where it's like, oh, you're supposed to do X, Y, Z. And, you know, that's
it's exactly right. As you were talking, Omar, you reminded me of this quote from Nick Saban, probably one of the most effective coaches of all time. He's coached the Alabama football team for God knows how many years. And he said, average players want to be left alone. Good players want to be coached, and great players want to be told the truth. And that's the same exact thing on your sales team. Like you as a seller, you need to proactively seek out feedback, proactively seek out the truth. Like you can't just sit in your corner and expect you to go and figure everything out yourself. Things are too complicated these days. So as a seller, be proactive to solicit feedback and take action on that feedback. As a manager, know that it is your job to teach and to coach and to proactively cascade that kind of mindset down throughout your team. And if you can find that right balance, then I'm confident you're going to have a lot better success. So we're right up against it here. Omar, any closing thoughts for the audience?
Yeah, no, absolutely. First of all, Kai, I want to just thank you and Clari for doing this. I really greatly appreciate it. I appreciate our partnership. Yeah, in terms of my closing thoughts, this is what I would say for my industry, kind of like a State of the Union address. You know, we've all seen the writing on the walls for a long time, like for the last 10 years. We've all been aware of this, but there hasn't been enough fear of the future to change. And let's just admit it, that behavior change comes when there's pain, enough pain for us to change, right? So the pain of changing was not bigger than the pain of the future. We all went through COVID and everybody was miserable. Everybody was scared to death about how they're going to sell everything. Now we've come out of COVID. Things are a little bit normal, but things have changed, right? But a lot of people have not changed with those circumstances, and we're still perpetuating the old way. And that doesn't mean that the old way, which is, again, relationship-based selling, the art of selling, that doesn't mean that's gone. What we have to do is really embrace a more sophisticated scientific approach to selling. And that's going to not only augment, but enhance the relationship side, right? And it's an amazing thing once you see these processes implemented the right way, the relationship side is further enhanced, versus right now, we as an industry, we're sitting on a one-legged stool of hiring relationship-based sellers, right? And just purely relying on that. And it's going to take one company to come that's going to compete with you and kick that stool out from underneath you. And I've seen it happen with great companies with great products, and they're hurting. And the time to do this is not when you're against the wall. That's my I guess closing thoughts on the fact that we have to change and we have to embrace that pain. But it's time to do it. You know,
it's well said, Omar. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been awesome. Really appreciate it. Can't wait for the next one. Everybody in the audience, thank you so much. Hopefully you found the right tips to boost sales performance. You have the right read on kind of what's going on in the industry right now. You have good insight into the types of things you can go and take and implement across your sales team today. If you don't have that Cadence playbook, check it out. The link is in the chat, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much, y'all.
Thanks, Kyle. Thank you for enjoying another epic episode of the State of MedTech. If you're feeling inspired and love this episode, do us a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn notifications on so you never miss an episode. And be sure to give us 5 stars and write a short review, because that helps more people discover this amazing community of ours. If you're a company who has an executive that you'd like to be on the show, or perhaps you want to sponsor one of the episodes, shoot us an email at hello@khateebandco.com. Take care, and we'll see you next time.